Our final speaker before lunch is another fellow and prototype recipient, Ben Dunks. He is a dancer and choreographer, and he's going to tell you more about that himself.
Good morning. Just arrange myself. So, to finish this morning off, the network have asked me to talk a little bit about my own journey to getting to where I'm currently at with working with technology in the way I do, and to explore a different idea of technology in terms of its application to solving issues in areas of the world that might not normally have this kind of interest or actually probably access to the technology. And what if what we do is simply using the technologies in ways that are really effective for us? So specifically from my background, what's the journey to using technology to examine and measure the exploration in the act of creating? The exploration of what happens if we're able to capture the process of making and creating complex movement and choreography, and then subsequently explore the impact of that. So I thought I'd just read the first sentence from my Immersion research question, which is: how do we map the movement of older people as they dance in a creative movement experience in order to demonstrate change that is measurable in such a way as to validate that movement experience as a pathway to a healthier and stronger life? I hope it's not just me who writes sentences like that. And before I start, I have to also be clear with you that a journey like this doesn't happen flying solo. There are many different people who've informed me in my work, who've opened doors when I didn't even realize there were doors, who've been influential across a range of ideas, connections, introductions, challenging conversations, amazing encouragement. In particular, over the past 4 to 5 years, Emma McFarlane and Chris Hunt have been crucial partners in exploring and discovering the ideas I'm going to talk to you about today. So this is a good example. That's how I've been feeling for the last 8 months doing this whole immersion process. So the journey begins about 7 years ago when, as artistic director of Attic Dance in Plymouth, I started to explore the impact that complex and creative improvised movement has on the cognitive learning capacity of children in primary schools. If you work in dance and you work with dance in primary schools, you know that there's an impact on children from what you do. Everyone who works doing this will have the same experience. Stories of parents, teachers, teaching assistants pulling you aside after a couple of weeks and saying, what you're doing with my child, this child, is having an impact. They're different, they behave differently, they're more focused at home, they're just different. So in reading a big funding bid award to a primary movement program in Belfast, I set about researching as much of the literature as I could find on the impact movement has on cognitive learning. And what I discovered was that complex movement is rather difficult to measure. Kind of an obvious statement, but it's only when you really start to look at that research you really start to understand. It's not only difficult to measure, getting causation of impact on cognition from a complex movement process is really challenging. It's not impossible, but it's massively challenging. And this idea kept coming up for me. How do we measure the movement we're doing? In particular, considering how complex the movement we're doing is. So when I started my research, the most complex movement study on cognition and movement was done in 2012, and then it was replicated in 2016. And this is a study getting pupils to do a variety of different activities using both left and right hands, bouncing volleyballs and dribbling footballs up and down a room. So, and when I read this, my heart sank. Like, if the most complex these people are measuring this recently is bouncing a volleyball and dribbling a football at the same time, which is kind of difficult, but it's not as complex as what I was doing, then how the hell is anyone supposed to measure what I get these children to do, which is basically multi-limbed, multi-leveled, jumping, sliding, always moving, three-dimensional complexity? So I put it to academics at various institutions. They were interested, but were kind of flummoxed by this complexity problem. Ultimately, they tapped out, unable to get a grip on these different movement relationships and how they interacted, how these relationships then linked to current research, and ultimately how this could all be framed in terms of an increase in cognitive potential. I think actually, probably at this point, I just haven't quite found the right academic yet. So this is when I met Chris Hunt. Chris had met Emma McFarlane, who at the time was the innovation producer for Attic Dance, and is one of the world's great networkers. Emma had been deep diving into new technologies, design processes, user design processes, and innovation. And Chris brought a mix of an amazing breadth of knowledge and skill in technology and innovation, allied to a personality that fit with the two of us. So I wanted to measure the general movement of the children in my sessions. And specifically, I wanted to measure the activity of the dominant wrist. So this is a general measure of gross motor activity, where there's a link between gross motor activity and working memory function, good correlation. And working memory function is super important to learning. So Chris introduced us to the idea of working with accelerometers as a tool to measure, a first step in tech. And actually what we also wanted to measure was the stillness in my children after these sessions. There was a solid reason for this. At the end of one of my sessions at Mount Street Primary School, a Year 5 class, teacher stopped me from packing up, pointed to her class and said, you got to see this. And they were stood against the wall, completely still, totally zen, chilled. This was probably one of the toughest classes in Plymouth at that time. And she basically said, this doesn't happen any other time. Your session, at the end of your session, they're like this. They go back into the classroom, an hour and a half, completely still, completely on it. We get amazing stuff done. I don't know what you're doing, but keep doing it. So when someone shows you that kind of impact, you want to measure it, right? You know what you're doing, but you really want to properly know what you're doing. You want to be able to map it. You want to be able to understand it in a more complex way. You can see the sort of the rotation, the complexity, and the smile on his face is one of my favorite things. I love that. You want to map it, understand it in a more complex way, and you also then want to know whether that mapped process is shareable and scalable. So this is where it gets tricky, because as an artist, there's a limit to the resources you're able to work with to develop these ideas. There's a limit to the tech you have access to. There's a limit to the understanding of your potential partners in schools. Suddenly you're on a mission to be exploring and playing with this creative movement and dance program with an education sector that's been sucked dry of any iota of support for innovation, let alone for the incredible things that the arts and creativity does for learning and the development of young people. And this isn't me bad-mouthing schools, by the way. I think primary school teachers are the great heroes of our world. They're just in a system that just doesn't allow them to do what they can do. So we use the accelerometers. We measured the change in movement and activity through the 5 weeks of the program, but we didn't measure the stillness. In fact, we couldn't measure the stillness because we needed multiple systems in place. Sometimes the classroom, or the class we just worked with, was on the other side of the school. So you're working with Bluetooth accelerometers, requiring a system to send it to the near vicinity, and you have a new class coming in. It all gets a little complicated and actually impossible to make happen. A lack of resources, basically, and hitting the limits of the world we're operating in. We did begin to show increased activity, by the way, and got some great visualizations out of what we do. So around the same time, I co-created and ran a pilot project, a research program with Erica Eaton from the University of St Mark and St John, exploring the impact of a heart rate on a parkour program I developed for secondary schools. So this is essentially a 45-minute program that's taught in schools as part of a PE curriculum, in secondary schools, some primary schools. And we worked with year 8, 9, and 10. And we used heart rate monitoring kit that came out of the Stone Age, so the next step of technology, but this was about 15 years old, this stuff. With 3 schools, total about 76 participants. We wanted to see the impact this program had on average heart rate across sessions, time in various zones of heart rate, and whether this satisfied the national curriculum guideline for PE. So our final paper is going to review in the coming months, but suffice to say our results are what we expected and then some. Average time with heart rates at over 50% of maximum heart rate in a 50-minute normal PE class is around 4 minutes. Average time for us was 26 minutes. Average time with heart rate at over 80% of maximum heart rate for the same time frame is about 30 seconds, and for us it was about 6 minutes. So also at the time, actually, I'll just show you that one as well. This was just our pilot at Plymouth School of Creative Arts, just getting our kit ready. Caleb over there sat at 213 for about 5 minutes. And my colleague waved me over, panicking, thinking that Caleb was about to have a heart attack. But he wasn't. The guy's just unbelievably fit. At the same time doing this, we bought a motion capture kit and started exploring the possibilities of these outputs, mocap outputs, with my youth company based at Dartington. Initially, I was interested in working with the mocap to create interesting animations, sort of translating the dancer's movement into sort of cool 20, 30-second animations. But actually what came out of working with the mocap suit was the potency of it as a tool by which training and levels of skills attained through dance training could be measured. And another thing happened when they viewed the capture of their movement. Because it's a robot-looking animation representing them, the dancers don't see themselves. They see an objective body moving in an interesting way. So this is the first time in my working life I've been able to have an objective conversation with dancers. This one-step removal about themselves and about their movement and without them hating watching themselves. This step removal is profound and something I may come back to in the future. Let's see if we can. You're gonna play. This is Maya on her first go in the mocap, and you'll see in a second that it's immediate response. So this is the robot. So then looking back at that, she was able to watch herself objectively for the first time. I'm being reminded to move on. So this brings me to the beginning of our Renaissance program, where we met Hazel Alexander, who's a community worker with Plymouth Community Homes. So Hazel has been working a little while with a group called the Barbican Legends, amazing older women in Plymouth you'll meet later. And on hearing what we're doing with primary pupils, thought it'd be interesting to bring that program to these legends. So we started sessions with the legends, and at the beginning of our second session, they started talking about falling. The friends of theirs who had fallen with big consequences, that it was something that was ever present in their minds when they went out, when it was raining, how far they were going, what the footpath surfer was like, all these elements. And of course, the first thought is, what is it about my movement program that they've been doing can I develop to support them in not having these concerns? And alongside this were other questions, which are, how quickly will they pick up these ideas? How quickly will they build strength? How quickly does an older body do these things? Popular culture tells us when we hit an age and we are no longer plastic, physically and mentally. You can't teach an old dog new tricks, which is just total bollocks. Because within 2 sessions, they'd changed. Their strength was different, their movement skill was different, their proprioception, ability to feel those differences was more advanced. And after I saw this was happening, and I was able to do some research on the focus of other falls programs that are out there, talk to different experts in the field around what interventions should be focused on, I started to think about the program I've now developed. It was then walking down that avenue of possibility that the Immersion Fellowship program came along. Now, this was the opportunity to explore the tool. So this is what I've been doing, specifically building a falls prevention program through using technologies to validate the work. So within this, I worked with CAMERA, which is the motion capture suite at Bath University, and working with Polly McGuigan, who's the deputy head of the Department of Health Centre for Analysis of Motion, Entertainment Research and Applications. It's a hell of a title. It's a brilliant title. She did the biomechanical analysis of the motion capture footage, looking at the balance of Gillian, Gloria, and Penny as it evolved over 6 weeks. Basically, I wanted to capture in tight detail their change in the movement as they did my program. And Polly and I had amazing conversations about the complexity of what we were trying to measure, the fact that with this movement program, there's no baseline measure of movement for any of it. In a normal study, there might be a sequence of movement that everyone does at the beginning, at the end, to establish markers and controls. We don't have that. And that doesn't sound particularly helpful when you're looking at research. But actually, it's fine, because everything we're doing is moving towards individualization, particularly these kind of movement programs. We don't necessarily want a cookie-cutter idea. We want to be able to individually mark. So that's what we've been doing. We've been measuring them against themselves. We've been using these technologies to really understand the movement development of these particular participants, but also to understand that person's evolution as the individual they are, which is really exciting. And this is just the beginning. Chris Hunt and I were also involved in the very first motion capture of a Parkinson's dance program in August of last year, and this was a world first. And we captured the physical change happening in a Parkinson's patient as a result of a dance class. So the complexity of movement as an incredible tool for intervention, for cognition, strength, confidence, and health is out there for us to explore and to measure and to spread. And just finally, none of this could have been possible without the Creative Technology Network, seeing my vision and ambition, backing me in 2 forms of funding, supporting my process, challenging my ideas, and being visionary themselves. I'd also really like to thank my colleagues Emma and Chris for their incredible work, and my fellow Immersion Fellows and prototype teams who are deeply inspiring with their visions and ambitions for the world. Thank you, and have a great afternoon.
Oh, look.
Oh, missed that one.
I'm just going to leave that for a moment to watch it. It's lovely. If you want to know more about what that is, you can find Ben at the Arnolfini this afternoon.